So hello guys, and welcome to another video. And recently, we got a developer interview for Mario & Luigi Brothership as a part of the Ask the Developer interview series that Nintendo usually does for most of their major games. Unfortunately, they didn't do one for the Thousand Year Door remake. That's probably because it was a remake, but I still would have loved to see a developer interview for that game, because I kind of want to know the future of the Paper Mario series and how the Thousand Year Door remake impacted that. But at least we got one for Brothership. At least we get a little bit of a glimpse into the Mario RPG renaissance. And there is quite a lot to unpack from this interview. And the thing is, it's actually not quite as stressful and depressing as the Origami King interview, which is, it's finally nice to see a Mario RPG interview that actually is interesting, actually is kind of positive, and actually shows some interesting things. And actually kind of makes me feel hopeful about the future of the Mario RPGs. But let's go ahead and talk about the first part, because it's really interesting. Because they mentioned that before they started working with Acquire, that they almost gave up on the Mario & Luigi series after Paper Jam. They were trying to think of different ideas, and that was also around the time that Alpha Dream was kind of declining. So I think things were really uncertain around that time, even when the remakes were releasing, because the remakes were really just like some, they really, like, I mean, they did have some effort put into them, but they weren't like whole new games, so they were like still like thinking of certain ideas and ways to bring back the Mario & Luigi series. And yeah, they could have completely given up on it. I don't think the series would have permanently went dormant. I just think we probably would have waited longer for a new game, kind of like Mario Strikers. We probably would have had to wait like a decade for a new game rather than just 5 years. I know it's been a decade since Paper Jam, but I mean like a decade since the Bowser's Inside Story remake, which is kind of what I consider to be like the end of like the Alpha Dream era, I would say, in terms of like Mario & Luigi games, since like technically the remakes count as like Mario & Luigi releases and everything. But we probably would have had to wait at least a decade after the Bowser's Inside Story remake, rather than just a few years after it. So that was definitely kind of concerning to think about, that they were almost considering giving up on it. And honestly, like some of the ideas that they probably had for a title like shortly after Paper Jam were probably incorporated, well, I mean both in Brothership, but as well as like the remakes as well, with the side campaigns with like Bowser's Minions and Bowser Jr.'s Journey. I feel like things like the Best Fitness Friends or like early ideas for the next game. And actually, when you think about Brothership, technically the extension core was kind of like an interpretation of that idea. They didn't specifically mention it in this interview, but I have a feeling that was kind of like an evolution of that idea. So I feel like there could have been some things reworked into Brothership that were originally ideas that were going to be in the next Mario & Luigi game after Paper Jam. So I think that's interesting to think about. But they chose Acquire. They did mention like Acquire having like kind of some history working on RPGs and things like Octopath Traveler and things, and also like 3D games as well. I mean, it kind of makes sense, like kind of looking at how Nintendo saw Acquire with the different games that they developed. They kind of saw Acquire as like a company fit to develop the new Mario & Luigi game. So yeah, and kind of looking at Nintendo's perspective of that, it kind of makes sense. I do definitely think Acquire was the right choice for this, and I think they did a very good job with Brothership. Even though it was kind of controversial to a lot of people, I thought Brothership was amazing, and I can kind of see why Nintendo chose Acquire, especially because of Octopath Traveler. And with that point of Octopath Traveler that they mentioned, since Acquire was the developers of that, I think it's interesting that they mentioned the possibility that it was going to be an HD 2D game. I actually mentioned the idea before even Brothership was announced, like that if they brought back Mario & Luigi, it would have been interesting if they used the HD 2D style with that. I have some problems with the HD 2D style, more so with how some developers kind of handle it, because sometimes like there's too much bloom effect. It's not like it's the colors are too dull and it's too blurry, but I feel like done right, HD 2D can really work. Like if we look at the Dragon Quest III HD 2D remake, that looks really good, and it actually kind of looks reminiscent of the Mario and Luigi 3DS games a little bit. And they even mentioned the Bowser's Inside Story remake in the interview, like as an example of how they could have possibly brought Mario and Luigi into an HD 2D style, like having like those 3DS style sprites in like a kind of an HD background. I think that would have looked really nice. But then they decided to go with 3D, but I kind of do prefer the fact that they did go with 3D in the end, because I feel like they handled it really well. And also due to the fact that Mario and Luigi already was kind of working with 3D with the giant battles and the papercraft battles and Paper Jam, so I still think it was a good fit to do 3D and everything. And they also mentioned that 3D would have been a little more recognizable to most fans, and that's kind of Nintendo's perspective of it. So I definitely understand that sentiment and everything. Because, like, I mean, I know now, like, ever since 2023, Nintendo doesn't care too much about Mario being, like, super consistent, like how the games were in the 2010s. But there still is some brand consistency there, and I think keeping most of the games in 3D, or at least, like, having, like, a style that's recognizable enough, like Paper Mario, kind of makes sense. Like, having most games in 3D, or with 3D visuals, kind of makes sense nowadays and everything. But that kind of leads us into the second part of the interview here, with how they talked about how they designed the game and how they designed a lot of, like, either the characters or some of the concepts and things, and the whole visual style and everything. Because they were originally thinking of having kind of like a darker style for Mario and Luigi. I mean, in the final game, there definitely are a lot of dark elements, especially later in the game, which I won't mention because of spoilers. But like earlier in development, I think they were going for even a darker tone, I would say, with how they had this rugged Mario concept, with how like Mario and Luigi kind of looked like injured, or like had these kind of cool designs and everything. And Mario was even wearing like a cloak in one of them, which looks pretty cool. But yeah, the concept art looks really nice for this. But Nintendo kind of wanted Acquire to stick a little closer to the Mario and Luigi style, which I do think is understandable. Like, I don't think Nintendo was trying to tell them to fit within the kind of like narrow kind of idea of like the Mario style. I don't think it was anything like the mandates or any of the 2010s Mario restrictions. I feel like they were thinking that, like, Nintendo was thinking of this more of a perspective of they want the fans of the Mario and Luigi series to recognize these designs as like a new Mario and Luigi game, kind of following the previous 5 games and everything. So I think that's how Nintendo was kind of thinking about it. And I do think, like, this concept could have worked a little more if they I think these concepts were just kind of like general ideas of like Mario and Luigi, like if they had like a more kind of like darker style. But I feel like this could be translated into like the more Mario and Luigi-esque art style. I just think these were kind of like rough concepts of like how they would kind of work with this with Mario in general. But I'd like to see them revisit that at some point. Like, even though Brothership already kind of goes into darker themes in the final game, I'd like to see them continue doing that in certain ways. I think that would be really cool. And they also mentioned some things about like how Acquire was really studying the Mario and Luigi style and looking like very deep into it and kind of like breaking down that style and adapting it like really well into 3D. And I didn't see, like, I know I've mentioned before that I didn't see any of the artists that worked on the previous Mario and Luigi games in the credits of Brothership, but I think that was really just Acquire's artists adapting the Mario and Luigi style so well Like, they've looked at all of these previous games and adapted it, like, nearly perfectly, I would say. Like, I think that, like, it was just a coincidence that, like, a lot of these designs resembled, like, Dream Team's design so much. I feel like they probably took, like, the most from Dream Team, I would say. They probably studied Dream Team quite a lot. Probably due to the fact that that was the last time Mario and Luigi was, like, super creative. I mean, yeah, they probably did account for, like, some of Paper Jam's designs when, like, referencing Mario and Luigi. But from, like, Acquire's perspective of developing a Mario and Luigi game that had, like, a very creative and ambitious vision. So, it kind of makes sense when thinking about it in that way. And also, there was a little bit of inspiration from, like, Bowser's Inside Story and Partners in Time as well. I feel like a lot of the areas kind of remind me of Partners in Time, I would say, in terms of, like, how they look and how they're designed and everything. But yeah, and another thing about this that I think is interesting is the fact that Nintendo was insisting on the game being very similar to the other Mario and Luigi games because of the fans. They were actually considering the fans in this instance, which is a sharp contrast from, like, how things were kind of stated in the Paper Mario interviews. Like, I remember Tanabe stating that, like, we kind of care about the fans, but we kinda don't care. I mean, in a way you can interpret that as them wanting to do their own ideas, but at the point when the game has a lot of flaws, and you aren't listening to the criticism, and there's 3 games in a row when you're not really taking into account that the game does have some flaws, that is a problem, I would say. And I think Nintendo, they kind of saw that approach. And honestly, I'm wondering, with that interview with Tanabe, I'm wondering if Nintendo actually saw the backlash to that and actually considered changing their approach on how they develop the Mario RPGs and actually consider the fans while also doing interesting and creative ideas as well. Because I think completely disregarding the fans isn't really the best look for Nintendo. I mean, as much as we'd like to think that Nintendo doesn't care about the fans, I don't think that's the image that they want to have. So, with the fact that they were so insistent on Brothership being faithful to the older Mario and Luigi games, I think is pretty interesting, and is definitely a sharp contrast from how things were handled with Paper Mario. But some other things that were mentioned in this part of the interview were pretty interesting as well. Like, some things were taken from the 3D Mario games, like with the fact that the running cycle was kind of based on Odyssey, which kind of makes sense, as they'd have to have some kind of 3D Mario interpretation to use as a reference, and Odyssey is probably, like, the best game to use for that. So I think that's pretty cool that they, like, I can kind of see a tiny smidge of Odyssey kind of inspiration in Brothership. So I think that's interesting as well. And another thing that they showed was some concept art, which was really cool as well. Like, we got to see some for Connie and Snoutlet. Like, I like the ones for Connie, they look pretty cool. The second one kind of reminds me of Prince Dreambird a little bit, but it also kind of has like a, like the Mario-style human-esque designs, which we don't really see a lot. It kind of gives me vibes of that. And then with Snoutlet, I think Snoutlet's designs look kind of funny too. There's a lot of really interesting ones here. But yeah, I do prefer that the design that they went with, since that makes more sense, but it is really interesting to see the concept art. And then they also showed Ship-Shape Island too. And it almost gives me like Superstar Saga vibes, which I feel like they were clearly kind of like inspired by there, because they were basing so much of Brothership off of the other Mario and Luigi games that it kind of makes sense that it would have some of that influence there. So it's pretty cool to see as well. And then moving on to the next part, they kind of discussed the story more, which I think is interesting, like with the whole theme of connections and kind of incorporating that into like different parts of the game. So I think that is really cool, like either things like kind of revisiting the other islands, or like the Luigi logic and different things like that. There were like a lot of ways that they kind of like tied into the story into everything. They even mentioned on like the fourth part of the interview how they made like a lot of the cutscenes seem like so cinematic, which I really like. That is something that they have been doing kind of like across the Mario RPGs as a whole, between like Paper Mario, Super Mario RPG in this game. So I think that's nice to see they kind of like elaborated on that as well. And another thing that I think is interesting that they mentioned is kind of the resemblance that the opening cutscene had to the movie. Apparently, that was a coincidence. That actually wasn't inspired by the movie, which I guess kind of makes sense, as this game has been developed for like a few years, and the movie only came out last year, so I think it would have been weird if that was just like incorporated last minute. Because they did say how they saw the movie and thought that was interesting, how their idea that they had in the game was very similar to what ended up happening in the movie. But it worked out pretty well, because this released only like a year and a half after the movie, and I like a lot of people would see the resemblance to that. So I think it's a pretty funny coincidence there, and I'm actually kind of glad that they mentioned it, because like a lot of people were saying like, oh, Brothership was inspired by the movie, when it was really just a coincidence. I think it's kind of funny when like a lot of things in the Mario franchise end up being coincidences. Like there's just like so many things that like end up happening and everything. But like that instance I just think is kind of funny. But yeah, and with also the fact that they were kind of emphasizing the fact that they wanted to write a meaningful and interesting story in the game based off of like connections and everything is so refreshing to hear. I am so glad we are past the days of, oh, we couldn't think of a story. I feel like that specific quote from Paper Jam was really just an excuse to say that they weren't able to do anything interesting, because at that point, they were really just reusing a lot of stuff from Sticker Star. I think they were reusing a lot of assets at the time, since Alpha Dream was struggling, and they likely didn't have the development time to do that either. But either way, I think I'm so glad that we are past the days of either we couldn't think of a story, or ever since Super Paper Mario we avoided stories that were complicated. No, we don't have any of that here. We have developers and writers that are insistent on making a memorable and interesting story here in a Mario RPG, which is so refreshing to hear. I am just so glad that they didn't hold back on the story here. It's just amazing, and I'm glad that this interview existed. Like, even though it's a little concerning to think that Nintendo almost gave up on the Mario and Luigi series, it still was nice seeing that they were so insistent on the Mario and Luigi series, like the next game being consistent with the other games and having what fans want. Because honestly, I think that makes me very hopeful about Paper Mario too. Because if they were so insistent about Mario and Luigi, just imagine how insistent they are that the next Paper Mario game will have what the fans want and everything. Like after the disaster of the Color Splash and Origami King interviews, I'm not saying that the games themselves are disasters, because I quite like Origami King. I thought that was a great game. Don't confuse that one thought I had. I had to specify that. But after the disasters of those interviews, and that I feel like Nintendo definitely saw that that wasn't a good look for them, and kind of started to look more into how the Mario RPGs are being developed, and that definitely gives me a lot of hope here. Like with Thousand Year Door, that might have even been part of the reason why they developed that game, because they saw the support, and they saw that people wanted a Paper Mario game like the older ones. So I'm just really hopeful about the future of the Paper Mario series now, if Nintendo does give a similar approach on intelligent systems as they did with Acquire for Brothership. But yeah, anyways, thank you guys for watching this video. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more, and make sure to check out my Discord server and Blue Sky if you want to. Goodbye.